Well, I named my podcast Pioneers of Outlaw Country because it dawned on me one day is that this is outlaw country. That's what Wyoming was. It's where people went to escape. They changed their names. They changed who they were, their whole identities. So there are people here in Wyoming that cannot trace their ancestries back because they don't know who their great-grandfather really was.
Stories That Live in Us is a podcast that inspires you to form deep connections with your family, past, present, and future. I'm Krista Cowan, known online as the Barefoot Genealogist. I've spent my whole life discovering the power of family history, and I know that sharing the stories that live in you can change everything. My guest today is Jackie Dorothy. She is an award-winning historian and journalist out of Wyoming. She is also a member of the Northern Arapaho tribe and a descendant of the Eastern Shoshone tribe of the Wind River Indian Reservation. And she has taken the family stories that have been passed down to her through her family and turned them into a full career as a historian in the state of Wyoming, who is creating educational curriculum for the state and also has a new podcast called Pioneers of Outlaw Country that is just dramatic retellings of characters in that part of the world. I'm excited for you to hear from Jackie about her family history and the stories that she finds important to tell. So tell me a little bit about kind of your background, like how you got into education, and I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Well, actually a historian, but I worked in marketing for years. And let's see, I guess I could go back to start at the beginning when I started this trajectory. I've always been loving journalism. I was a DJ, showed up in Wyoming, and I was ready to start all over when I was 28. And I told my mom, I was like, I'm going to work there. And 2 weeks later, I got a job at the radio station. And from there, it just kind of snowballed. I worked at Wyoming PBS, met my husband there. I was his intern. We like to tease about that. And then I just continued on. I've always loved history, always loved genealogy. That was definitely where it got started. And just digging in and finding the actual stories. And I think what I really liked is when I discovered that someone tells me a story and then I can do the research and verify it for them. I brought people to tears, and that makes me emotional because it's so cool. It's like I had this one elder tell me this story. He says, my grandfather said that we gave horses to a president. I don't know which president. I don't know why we did this. And I found the pictures. I found the pictures of the Arapaho tribe presenting these horses to the president of the United States.
Wow.
And it was he just sat there stunned. He's like, it's true. It really happened.
Yeah, it's so interesting because so many people live in families where there's lots of oral traditions.
Yes.
And some of those stories, like a game of telephone, get morphed over time and change into something else. But when you can find the thread of truth through the documentation, it's such a thrill to be able to make those connections for people.
Well, it's just like I shared with you through just some of my texts, is like the outlaw connection. My dad assumed that it was Jesse and Frank James that his grandfather ran around with. But then when I started because his name's Jesse, and he thought, well, I was named after Jesse James. It's like, actually, no, Dad, this is kind of cool. The dates didn't align, nothing worked, and the time frame, nothing. But then when I started doing the research, it's like, actually, your grandfather and my dad's grandfather, that's what gets me. It's this grandpa ran around with Butch Cassidy. They were the same age, same area that they were in. And my what would he be? My uncle, my great uncle was known in historical records to have been friends with Butch Cassidy. And so the stories started to make sense. They were real. And to be able to tell my grandma that before she died is like, okay, I connected the dots. Here you are.
That's amazing. I love that. Well, let's go back a little bit to kind of your interest in family history. Like, as a historian, sometimes we clue in on specific times or places in history that we're drawn to. But at what point did your history interest and your family history interest kind of cross, or did they kind of grow up together?
No, they crossed because I grew up between Alaska and Wyoming. My mom's parents homesteaded in Alaska, so I was always kind of interested in that history. But when we moved here permanently to Wyoming, and I started working with Wyoming PBS and seeing how close our history was actually to us, and that my family was like merged into that. So I'd start going down rabbit holes, and I had the privilege of visiting with people that actually knew my great grandparents and were able to connect that history. And so that is where the genealogy aligned with the history. And it just kept connecting the dots, growing that tree and seeing where it would lead.
That's amazing. I love
It
that.
was
And I
so
love
much
that you had
fun.
that accessibility. Not everybody does. And so to be able to talk to people who knew things and to be in the place where they lived, that's, I think, a great privilege. So as you think about that, like, is there from your earliest days of being involved in your family history, is there a particular story or discovery that lit you up?
I think I would have to go right back to when I first discovered genealogy. And that was at my grandma's table because my grandma is Northern Arapaho, but she's also Eastern Shoshone. And when you look at the blood quantum, and we do that in tribal history, is because in both our tribes, you have to prove your enrollment by how much blood you have. So she was looking at it and proved that even though we claim to be Arapaho, we are really Eastern Shoshone, tinier tribe, more money. And so she was going through trying to prove to the courts and to the tribes that we should actually be enrolled in Shoshones. And so that was, she would have the papers all laid out on the kitchen table, and she would be going down and saying, all right, here is my grandfather was actually considered full-blooded Shoshone. Turned out later he was half-blood. I mean, it really gets complicated when you go into it, but it was really fun to watch her trace it back. And then, of course, being tribal, you had fun names. Like she finally admitted that, yes, I do have an Indian name, and my grandmother's Indian name was She Who Talks Too Fast. And that was given to her by her grandparents because she would rush in and she'd be so excited that she just talked too fast. And that's what they called her. And her mother, though, was called Bear Woman or Bad Woman. And I was like, well, how did she earn that name? And then another one was like Bad Looking Woman. And it's like, what? It was because they had tempers and they were known, you don't cross those women. And that was the name they wore with pride. And so that was part of our genealogy, is seeing those names and then being able to go back and figure out how they earned them. That has been fun.
Yeah, wow, that is such a unique part, I think, of Indigenous culture that so many other cultures miss out on, which is that the names have such a significant meaning. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, but did those names ever change through a person's life?
They
I think I
do.
understood that.
You do understand that correctly, because when I was going through the genealogy, I've been really blessed because there was a historian that came and wrote a book about my family. And so he had all the stories and all these little pieces he put together. And one of them was you go back to it was the early 1800s, and this guy's name was Owl. But before that, he was known as Good Looking Man, and they explained the tradition of how he gave that name up is that they were at a ceremony and he was admired, and this lady asked him to give that name to her son. And so he discarded that name, and she ran out and she physically grabbed the name and brought it back and gave it to her son. And so there was not just a mere dropping of your name. There was a reason something would happen, something significant, and you would earn a name. And that name, that old discarded name, was quickly grabbed up by whoever could grab it.
And
And
that
it
then
result,
becomes part of the story too, right?
yes, it does. And that's what has been fun. And again, I find that out as you're not just tracing a tree, you're actually start to explore, well, how did this happen? Wait, they were here at this particular time. Another of our family legends was that I can't even remember how many great grandmothers, but her name was Matilda. She became a Matilda spoon hunter, but they said that she was a survivor of Sand Creek Massacre. So through the dates and through everything that happened, I was able to figure out that what had happened is in Colorado, the militia had come through. Unfortunately, they were drunk. It was a horrific massacre of men, of mostly women and children. And the person that defended them was another white soldier. And he came through, and it's just this part of history that we know happened. And to know that my great great grandmother survived it, and that's why we are here. It puts you in place into that history, but it also makes you look at it and say, this is significant, not just to the country, but to our particular family. And I was able to prove that, yes, she was there. All the dates aligned, the year aligns, everything that our family said, because the historical story was that she was in a riverbank and she dug a hole and hid, and that was how she survived.
Wow. I can't even imagine. How old was she at the time?
I believe she was like 13, so young
Wow.
teenager.
Yeah. So if she hadn't, you really wouldn't be here.
Exactly. You look at those little things, it's like the ones that died in the family lineage that ceased to exist.
This grandmother is your dad's mom. Is that the connection?
Yes. And what's really unique about our family is that we actually go through the female lineage for our tribal ancestry.
Oh, okay.
And it's something that I discovered again as I'm going through genealogy. It's like it was my grandmother and her mother, all of them were the Arapaho. The men were from different tribes, starting
Mm-hmm.
with Spoon Hunter. And that was another interesting story because I'm sure you've heard of the Battle of the Little Bighorn.
Mm-hmm.
And so Spoon Hunter was over in that battle, and there was a group of Arapaho there. And he, instead of going back to the Pine Ridge Reservation in the Dakotas, he went with the Arapaho to the Wind River Indian Reservation. Enrollment started, and he's Indian looking, right? And so they tell the cavalry there, like, oh no, this guy, he's a Arapaho. He's one of us. And
Mm-hmm.
so instead of being enrolled full-blooded Sioux, he was enrolled full-blooded Arapaho, even though
Interesting.
that wasn't even his tribe. He was adopted into it. And that's how it worked back in those days. It was who you identified as, not what you really were, so to
Sure.
speak.
Sure.
And
And
so
so,
he married this Arapaho, and then her daughter married a different tribe, and so on and so forth. But we always kind of went down that female lineage until my dad, and he still identifies as an Arapaho.
interesting. That's so fascinating. And so typically in the culture then, is it because the men come from elsewhere? Is that why you think that that is done that way? And the women aren't going to like live with their husbands' families?
It just happened that way in our particular family.
Oh, okay.
Because there are other families that, like the Fridays, they all come from Chief Friday. And most of the Spoon Hunters, their family comes through the male lineage.
Okay. That
And so
makes
it's
sense.
just so happened with the uniqueness of us was that it just was the women. And it particularly like with my grandmother, my great grandmother, Pearl Eisenus, her dad and mom were married the Indian way, but there was so much strife between the Shoshone and the Arapaho at that time that their union did not work and they separated. Each one took a child. And
Oh, wow.
so Pearl, my great grandmother, ended up with her mom, and her sister ended up with her dad, raised Shoshone. And that was just how that family line worked. And we had to go back and search for her too, the missing Shoshone child, because it was like grandma knew that there was an aunt out there, but she didn't know anything about her. And actually, it kind of upset my grandma for quite a few years that that was how the separation happened. And she was in denial until she really started looking at the line and saying, okay. And towards the end, she says, yes, that was my aunt.
So you've gotten involved in this and you have this really rich heritage, which I think is beautiful. And thank you for sharing a view into that. I think that that's something that a lot of us don't have a lot of exposure to. It's interesting because there's a lot of myth around Native American ancestry, particularly in the United States. I work for Ancestry as my day job. And one of the like very top complaints that we get from people after they've taken an Ancestry DNA test is that we must have done something wrong because where's their Native American, little slice of the pie chart that they get back? And the reality is that most of those stories in most families here in the United States is total myth. It's the game of telephone that got morphed. In my family, it was because they lived in Indian territory in Oklahoma and Arkansas. And that got passed down, and somebody then just interpreted that to mean, oh, well, we must have indigenous, blood in our family. And we don't at all. But I know how those stories get started. And so for you to come from that culture and to have a rich history of that culture, thank you for sharing that with us. I think that that's important for people to hear and to understand that there is documentation, that you can prove those connections, that the tribes are very well kept track of. And even back in, you said, into the 1800s, I think it's amazing that there's those kinds of records. For your part of it in the history, particularly in the Wyoming area, what records are you using? How are you, where are you finding that information other than just through family story?
Well, definitely ancestry.com. I use that as a research tool. And knowing our family names as well helps. And we did do the DNA test, and it did come back where we had that slice of Native American history. And what was really cool, and here's a really fun story that Ancestry actually proved, is that in our genealogy, because we do have to keep that really tight record in order to keep our enrollment, there was somebody named Seminole. And I was like, what in the world? And from it was the 1840s.
Isn't
And
the Seminole tribe from like Florida?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. It turns out Basil Lizinus on our Shoshone side was a Seminole from Florida. But he was also, I thought, French because of his last name, but French doesn't even show up. But he was a trapper and an explorer that was with Kit Carson and came this direction, was very well respected in the tribe. Everyone knew he was a Seminole, and that was his Indian name. His American name, however you want to call it, European name, was Basil Lizinus, but he was also known as Seminole.
That's amazing.
And so that was how I did the research, is that going in the back of books and looking at indexes and looking for the family name. I mean, that was how I did it when I was a teenager. And then it just expanded. I love to search out newspapers and put in the name and just see if a tidbit comes up, because that was the gossip columns, right? That was the early Facebook. And then using Ancestry to kind of look for those other future records and finding marriage license. And I mean, I found out that one of our ancestors married a Blackfoot Indian, and it was because she had a marriage license from Billings, Montana.
One of the benefits for doing Indigenous research is because they were so connected to the land, to the place. When you find someone in a place, you at least have some clue of the connection, which I think is incredible to be able to recognize that, because you know where the tribes were located.
And another story that we were talking about earlier too is on my white side. So Pearl Lizinus, who was she was the Shoshone girl raised Arapaho by her Arapaho mother. Well, the dates aligned again, where her husband, she married when she was 18 and he was 43. He was a member of the Hole in the Wall gang, and Butch Cassidy was one of his friends. And when he retired, he went to the reservation where it was kind of safe and married this young girl. And they had 10 kids, and they all stayed on the reservation. And it was following his lineage then and saying, well, how did he end up here? And my aunt actually discovered that he was a Quaker raised in Iowa and ran away and came to Wyoming, where he cowboyed. And how it worked with the Hole in the Wall gang in Wyoming is that they would have their day job, just like you're saying ancestry.com is your day job. Well, his day job was as a cowboy on these ranches. And then once in a while, they go out and do a job somewhere. And it was just a very loose 100 people part of this gang with a core group. And again, we were able to connect the dots and say, oh, he was part of this. The dates align, the stories align, because the story my grandma told, and this is the one that I really love is that she said when she was growing up, because she was 8 years old when her dad died, but before he passed away, she remembers this old man coming named Curly. He would show up in the spring with his donkey, and her dad and him would go into the Wind River Mountains for about 2 weeks, come back with enough money to take care of the family for the rest of the year. And the records also clearly state that Butch Cassidy, one of his catches, one of the places he hid money was in the Wind River Mountains. So here was my great grandfather going and getting, but enough so that they stayed under the radar and didn't make anyone suspicious about why they had all this money.
Wow. And so as an 8-year-old girl, how do you think it is that your grandmother interpreted that to pass that story to your father? Like, how does that story get passed from one generation to the next?
Well, it's funny because she never shared that story
Oh,
until I
okay.
started bugging her about it.
Uh,
I wanted to know about her dad. And I was like, tell me stories that you know. And so she didn't have that many memories of her father. He was strict. She said when she found out about the Quaker connection, she goes, well, that explains the these and thous and why he was as strict as he was. But this was just one of those stories that she had. And she's like, I don't know. I never thought about it. And so then we started exploring it together. It's like, well, Grandma, you can't just go up into the mountains for 2 weeks and come back with money. And she goes, I didn't think about it. It was just, that was how it was.
that's funny. Yeah, like you think about so many of the stories that we kind of cement in our brains come from our perspectives as a child and the things we overheard or the things we observed and how we interpreted those things with our completely undeveloped brains. And yet those then become the foundation for the stories that we tell ourselves and others our whole lives. And to take that pause and have to like rethink that, I think is something that family history and exploration of our family stories allows us to do and realize that maybe our perception wasn't entirely accurate.
I love that because the other thing that I remember from my childhood, which really had an impact on me, was learning that my great grandfather was an outlaw and how I learned it. It was because my grandmother and my great aunt Grace were sitting at the kitchen table discussing their father and how he made his money. And Grandma Olson said, Daddy was an outlaw. And Aunt Grace said, no, he wasn't. And my Aunt Grace was the oldest child. So she remembered all this stuff. And my grandma's like, got on the kitchen table and they're in their 50s and they're arguing back and forth to the point where us kids were ushered out of the room. But all I can remember is my grandma taunting her older sister and said, Daddy was an outlaw. And Aunt Grace is like, no, he wasn't. Because it wasn't a point of pride during that time. Now it's like people embrace it. Oh, my great grandpa was an outlaw. But back in those days, you did not admit to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so interesting that the things that we find, were shameful now not only are not shameful, in some cases, they're kind of celebrated. So you have taken this celebration to a whole different level with a podcast and a career that revolve around telling not just your family stories, but the stories of all kinds of outlaws and colorful characters, particularly as it relates to Wyoming history. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about why you decided to head that direction with your career.
Well, I named my podcast Pioneers of Outlaw Country because it dawned on me one day is that this is outlaw country. That's what Wyoming was. It's where people went to escape. They changed their names. They changed who they were, their whole identities. So there are people here in Wyoming that cannot trace their ancestries back because they don't know who their great grandfather really was. And as I dived into that and discovered all the colorful characters that there were here, it just got to be so much fun. And to build a family tree and to say, this is how this person ended up here. I'll take an example. On my podcast, there's a one called Walt Putney, a lesser light of the Hole in the Wall game. And so what Walt was, is he came here when he was 14 years old. Actually, his brother came here at 14. He was 16. And his family back east just told everybody he's in the cattle business. And he was for the first few years. But it was interesting to trace back that he came from a good family. It wasn't like he was a runaway. He wasn't anything. He just went off to become a cowboy. And through a series of events, he ended up being an outlaw, and he felt forced into it because he was there is a guy named Jay Torrey, and you can go into that whole story. And that's what I think I find so fascinating, is how intertwined everything is. And so I explore Walt Putney, figure out why he became an outlaw, figure out what happened to him in his later years. He became a respected businessman here in Wyoming after spending a couple of years in his youth as a wild outlaw. Jay Torrey, who forced all these guys, he was a big cattle baron. He had these guys working for him and would get mad when they wanted to start their own ranch. And so he would use the courts, use his money to go against these young cowboys, take their land, take their property, and they had no choice in their eyes than fleeing and becoming an outlaw to sustain themselves. And so then you're like, who's this Jay Torrey? And that's how it kind of expands beyond just my family history and into all of these interesting stories that nobody knows about. And that's what really gets me, is because one of the reasons I even started this is I was in the schools talking to the teachers about history. And they said, well, our history isn't that interesting. And I'm thinking, we're right here in the middle of the hole in the wall. This is their territory, and you guys don't know it? And they're like, well, look at our resources. And they showed me the books, the stories that they had to share with their kids. And it's like boring. It's those textbooks that people write and they just write the facts and they don't tell the stories. And so that's what has led me in the direction where I'm at, is I'm a storyteller, and I want to make sure that the stories I tell are factual, but interesting as well. And that is kind of where my journey has taken me. And now I'm working with the teachers. I'm working to build curriculum to try to make it so that we have that viable history to give our teachers. Because by Wyoming legislature, we have to teach Wyoming history. We have to teach our area history, but we also have to teach our tribal history. And what's being taught is about the Pueblos or the Aztecs. And I told my son, I was like, that's not our tribes. You're not learning about the Arapaho, the Shoshone, the Blackfeet, the Crow. And he's like, who are they? And I was like, this is not good. You need to know who these people are. And that's what it is filling that void and letting our children and our teachers know our rich history.
Yeah. And that's so important because it's, we become connected not just to our family, but again, to that concept of place and understanding, what we're surrounded by, because the environment that we are raised in, the environment we raise our children in, that's the environment that forms that foundation of the perceptions that we then move forward with in life. So how do you decide what stories to tell?
Well, right now I've been working on a series about the Yellowstone Highway. It is this Wind River Scenic Byway that cuts through the canyon, a beautiful stretch of land, but it's celebrating its 100th anniversary. And no one in the state knew this. And I think I've been advocating for it, and this is embarrassing, but for 10 years, saying this important anniversary is coming up. And so it got the awareness, it got the excitement, but it was like, this isn't just about a road, it's about the stories. So I've been searching for the stories along the highway, and just recently finished one on about our ferries of all things. But who realizes that when you drive over a bridge, that back in the day of our ancestors, that crossing that water was a task. It could be dangerous. It could claim your life. We've had drownings and near catastrophes occur as people tried to cross the Bighorn River. And so the ferry came in and supplied that safe passage. But now the bridges replace that, and we don't think about that part of our history. So those are the things that teachers are looking for, because that's where my mindset is like, okay, you were required to teach this. How can we make it interesting? And so you tell the story of the ferryman, and you make it alive. You bring it like, okay, let's dig through the newspapers. Let's find the stories. What was it like to cross the river in a ferry? How dangerous was it? And that's how I kind of dig up the story. So we're doing a whole series. We're ending it this year, and then I'm looking forward to what the new year will bring. But interesting stories. That's the hook. You got to take something boring and make it exciting.
Well, and it doesn't, I mean, it takes a lot of intention to do that, but I think that it's worth the effort. And I think sometimes people think, even with their own family history, like it's just names and dates and places, and how exciting is that really? But the way that you framed that, like the bridges and the ferries, like it's something so simple that if you just, again, shift your perception a little bit, you can see that there's a story there. And so then going after that story becomes that much easier because you've got a hook or an idea of how to approach that. I love the framework that you kind of set up for that. I think that's really beautiful.
And I will admit, it does take a lot of work.
Yeah,
It's a lot of digging, a lot of
family
reading.
history. Yeah, it all requires work, but the resources that we have available to us now, right? When I started family history 40 years ago, it required me, coming to Salt Lake City for a week every summer with my dad and scrolling through reels of microfilm or writing letters away to archivists and librarians and hoping they responded and had the one little nugget of information that I was looking for. Now I can sit down and in 2 or 3 hours on Ancestry or on newspapers.com or on the website of the state archive, there's so much that's been digitized, whether it's the actual records themselves or the finding aids to those records, that I can find a treasure trove of information in just a few hours. I sometimes feel a little guilty about how much more accessible it's become compared to how we used to do it years ago.
I share the same thing because I'm sitting here when you said 40 years. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's how long
Yeah.
I've been also doing it. And where does the time go? But and it was the same thing. Remembering my grandma, it was paper. It was tracing it down. It was her going to the tribal offices and sitting there and going through all of these files, looking for that physical evidence to prove who we were, where we came from, what our ancestry really was.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love the connections that you've made. I love the path that you've taken. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think there's so many things that people can learn if they want to engage in this for themselves, where they are in, maybe not at a state level like you're doing it, which I think is magnificent, but even just within their own family. So as you think about kind of the future, as you think about your path and your family stories and the state of Wyoming and what you're trying to accomplish there, what is it that you hope for the future?
Well, I have been asked by the state of Wyoming to expand beyond Thermopolis, beyond Hot Springs County and the reservation, and to bring stories from all corners of Wyoming. So I've been reaching out to the historical societies and saying, what stories do you want told? What is it that you want people to know about your area? Because my goal for the future is to make our kids excited for history, and not just our kids, but and that's what's fun about doing this podcast is that, yes, my goal, my thought, the person that I'm working for is that 8th grade social studies teacher that has to make history fun, but it's a podcast for everyone. It's a podcast for that history buff. It's a podcast for my 13-year-old son to listen to have that history come alive. So I really just want to make Wyoming history in particular accessible to everyone. And what's really been fun is when I do look at the podcast and who my audience is, my number one audience is Denver, followed by Michigan, followed by Australia. I mean, what does that tell you?
That tells me that history is interesting.
Yes, no matter where you are.
Yes. Yeah. And it's the stories. I think it's the stories that capture our imaginations. It's the stories that capture our hearts. It's the stories that help us feel connected to each other in ways, because whether you're coming from an indigenous tribe in Wyoming or sitting in suburban Salt Lake City like I am, or maybe even in Australia, there are some universal themes in stories of people and the choices that they make. Sometimes those choices feel impossible. Sometimes those choices feel like they're forced upon us. And sometimes it's a wide open field of choices and opportunities that we have to make our lives what we want them to be. But there are themes that are universal in the stories of people, and those stories are universal across time and space, I think. So it was no surprise to me at all that you have a wider audience.
Well, I've always preached that everyone has a story. And some of their stories are extraordinary, and it's just like it's easy to see what their story is. But others, you have to dig and find that little nugget, find that incident that they don't think they're special, but you know they are. And to be able to share that with others has been just, it's been a fun challenge. And I think that what I end up doing is I find the so-called boring people, and I dig until I find that exciting story, like the fairies. I mean, to make fairies exciting, and I think I was able to achieve that by digging up some stories, some dramatic stories of near drownings, and unfortunately, some drownings that happen. And it's the same way with people, is that if you listen long enough, you'll suddenly have the story.
That was beautifully said. And I think a perfect way to end our time together. Jackie, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I've listened to several episodes of your podcast. I'm excited to listen to more and to continue to follow your career. Thank you.
The same here. Thank you for what you do for genealogy.